In the beginning was the Word, but before the Word was the silence. 7 million years of it, stretching across the African savanna like an endless question, waiting for an answer. Picture them, our ancestors, moving through tall grass under an indifferent sky. Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus. Names were given to shadows, to fragments of bone, to the ghosts of what we once were. They had hands that could shape stone, minds that could remember, eyes that could see patterns in the chaos of existence. But they were still prisoners of the immediate, trapped in internal present of hunger and fear, survival and death. They were clever apes in a world that didn't care how clever they were. They came, the revolution, not a revolution of kings or kingdoms, but a consciousness itself. 7,000 years ago, in the synapse of a brain no different from yours, something extraordinary happened. A neural pathway fired, a connection formed, and for the first time in the history of the earth, a creature began to imagine things that had never existed before. This was the cognitive revolution, the moment where Homo sapiens became the animal that told stories. Not just any stories, stories that multiple minds could believe in together, stories that could bring strangers into armies, tribes, into nations, individuals into civilizations. There began the rise of human civilization. We became the first species to live in two worlds simultaneously, the world of objective reality, rivers and mountains, hunger and pain, birth and death, and the world of shared imagination, gods and ancestors, laws and legends, nations and money, the invisible architecture of meaning that holds society together. But before this moment, human groups were limited by the constraints of personal relationship. You could cooperate within 150 individuals, those you knew by name, whose face you memorized, whose trustworthiness you could judge through direct experience or indirect fairy tales from others. This is Dunbar's number, and it remains with us today, a fossil of a pre-revolutionary past. But with the birth of narrative consciousness, these limitations shatter. Suddenly, humans could cooperate in groups of thousands, then millions, then billions. Not because they knew each other, but because they believed in the same story about reality, about everything that's happening in this world. The transformation was as sweet as it was total. Within mere millennia, the storytelling apes had spread across every continent, driven the megafauna to existence, and began the long project of reshaping the world according to their shared dreams. Consider the magnitude of this achievement. At this very moment, you place your life in the hands of complete strangers. You board metal tubes hurled through the sky by people you've never met. You consume food prepared by unseen hands. You trade your labor for pieces of paper and digital numbers, trusting in their value because millions of others share the same trust. Millions of others are convinced that this story is real. This is not natural behavior. No other species does this. A chimpanzee would never accept a banana in exchange for a dollar bill, no matter how many other chimpanzees insist that paper has value. But we build our entire civilization on such arguments, collective decisions to believing things that exist only in sheer imagination. The first story weren't entertainment. They were weapons of cooperation that allows small bands of people to become the dominant force on Earth. Imagine this scene. 50,000 years ago, on the great migrants that carried our species across the world, two tribes encountered each other over a river crossing. In the animal kingdom, such meetings usually meant conflict, territorial disputes, competition for resources, the ancient calculus of predator and prey. But humans had developed something unprecedented, the ability to find common ground through sheer narrative. We follow the same ancestral spirits, we honor the same seasonal cycles, we recognize the same laws of kingship and exchange, we recognize that we are common in some ways. These were facts, these were arguments, these were agreements after those arguments, collective decisions to inhabit the same imagined reality. And the sheer reality allowed for cooperation on a scale never before seen in the history of life. The tribes that could tell the most compelling stories that could unite the most people under the same narrative umbrella passed an evolutionary advantage so profound. It reshaped the planet. They could organize larger hunts, mount more effective defenses, and expand into territories that would have been impossible for smaller groups to hold. But here, the plot thickens, for these early stories did not merely facilitate cooperation, they begin to transform the very nature of human consciousness itself. The ancient Greeks spoke of the shadow on the cave wall, Plato's famous allegory of prisoners mistakenly illusions for reality. What if Plato had it backwards? What if the shadows, the stories, the myth, the sheer fictions were not obstacles to truth, but the very foundation of human awareness? We don't live in reality, we live in a story about reality. And those stories don't simply describe the world. They create it, they shape it, they give it meaning and give it structure and give it purpose. So our humans can live in this world with what we thought as meaningful life. When our ancestors began to imagine gods, they weren't just creating explanations for thunder and lightning. They were inventing new forms of authority, new ways of organizing society, new definition of scarce and profane, right and wrong, us and them. New forms of reality called the intersubjective reality. When they began to imagine kingship beyond blood relations, the revolutionary idea that strangers could be brothers and sisters, they weren't just expanding their social networks, they were creating the very concept of community. The notion that belonging could be based on shared belief rather than shared genetics. When they began to imagine abstract concepts like justice, honor, and destiny, they weren't just developing philosophical ideas, they were constructing the cognitive infrastructure that would make civilization possible. The invisible framework of meaning that could allow humans to cooperate across vast distance of space and time, across vast species, across vast races, across everything. We all have a common ground, and a common ground is the narrative that we all believe in. These stories became the genetic code of human society, passed down through generations, mutating and evolving, but always serving the same fundamental purpose, binding individual minds into collective consciousness. Yet here lies the shadow side of our greatest achievement, the same cognitive revolution that made us the most cooperate species on Earth also made us the most susceptible to manipulation and control. Karl Marx, writing in the Industrial Age, observed that the stories we tell about society often serve to justify existing power structures. The myths of divine right, natural hierarchy, and the inevitable progress have been used throughout history to maintain the status quo, to convince the powerless that the powerlessness is natural, necessary, even scarce. Friedrich Nietzsche went further, arguing that our celebrated will to truth is actually a will to power, that even our most cherished beliefs are tools for domination, ways of imposing our own interpretation of reality on others in order to dominate, in order to gain power over them. Both philosophers were pointing to a fundamental truth, the same cognitive ability that allows humans to cooperate in unprecedented ways, also created unprecedented opportunities for ideological control. This is why understanding the origin of human storytelling is still merely an academic exercise. It is essential for understanding how power operates in the modern world, how societies rise and fall, how revolutions begin and empires die. Every political movement, even religious institution, every economic system, every social evolution in human history have been built on stories about who we are, where we came from, where we are going, and why should we trust those telling the story. The same narrative technologies that united our ancestors across fires in the African savannah still unite and divide us today. That inspires us to generate greatness and manipulate us towards destruction. They gave our lives meaning, yet traps us in the cycle of conflict and oppression. Consider money, perhaps the most successful story ever told. Thousands of years ago, humans made a collective decision to believe to a certain object. Shells, metals, pieces of paper possessed value beyond their material properties. These weren't based on any natural law or scientific principle. It was pure fiction, as imaginary as any myths or legend, gods or sacred beings. But it was fiction that enabled unprecedented economic cooperation and made possible trade between strangers, the accumulation of wealth across nations, the development of complex society built on specialization and exchange. Today, most money doesn't even exist in physical form. It consists of numbers in computers, digits on screens, electronic signals possessed beyond banks. Yet, we still believe in it. We still organize our entire lives around it. We still put our whole faith into some digital numbers that doesn't mean anything in the reality world. We still measure success and failure, happiness and misery by its accumulation and loss. This is the awesome power of shared fiction. It is not that money is real in any objective sense. It's that our collective belief in money makes it real, gives it power over our lives and our societies. The same principle applies to nations and nationalism. There's nothing natural about the borders drawn on maps. Anybody can change those lines if they want to. Nothing inevitable about the existence of France or China or the United States. These are imagined societies, imagined communities, held together by shared stories about history, culture, and identity. By trying to explain this to someone willing to die for their country, try telling a soldier that national identity is a collective fiction as they march into battle. Try convincing a refugee that borders are just lines on papers as they flee persecution. The story has become more real than the reality it was supposed to describe. The fiction has acquired a life of its own, shaping the world more powerfully than any material force. And so we arrive at the central paradox of human existence. We are the only species that cannot live without lies, but we're also the only species capable of recognizing them as lies. We need stories to function as human beings. We need sheer fiction to cooperate on a large scale. we need myths to find meaning in the existence. But we also possesses the unique capacity to step back, to analyze, to question everything, to see through the stories we tell themselves and the stories that others possessed on us. This is both our greatest strength and our most terrible burden. It is what makes us human, this ability to live simultaneously inside and outside our own narratives, to be both believers and skeptics, creators and critiques of the stories that define us. The ancient Greeks were among the first to embrace this dangerous capacity for self-reflection, living in a harsh landscape that forced them to trade and interact with many different cultures. They developed a unique skepticism about their own stories. The goals were flawed and petty, the myths contradictory and absurd, the democracy, an experimental form of collective decision-making, rather than a divinely ordained system or rule. For this culture, skepticism came philosophy, literally, the love of wisdom. The radical idea that we should question everything, even our most fundamental assumptions about reality, society, and the meaning of existence. Socrates, the fundamental figure of Western philosophy, was ultimately executed for his dangerous practice. His crime? Corruption of the youth by teaching them to think for themselves, to question the stories their society took for granted, the stories that are deeply embedded in the community, yet no one has the will to question or examine them with their own critical mind. But here's what the Greek understood, or sometimes forgot. Questioning stories doesn't mean rejecting them entirely. It means understanding the power, the purpose, and their limitations. It means becoming conscious participants in the ongoing of human projects of meaning-making. The goal is not to live without stories. That would be impossible. A return to the precognitive state of our ancestors. The goal is to choose our stories consciously, to recognize when they serve us and when they enslave us. To maintain the capacity for revision and adaptation as circumstances change. Because the stories that serve our ancestors may not serve us. The myths that unite small tribes may divide global societies. The fictions that worked in the agriculture age may be destructive in the digital age. Today, we live in an unprecedented era of narrative competition. Social media has democratized the power of storytelling, giving every individual the ability to create and share their own visions of reality, to find communities unite by shared beliefs and interpretations. But this democratization has also created unprecedented fragmentation. We are no longer united by common stories broadcasted by a few powerful institutions. Instead, we are divided into countless tribes, each with its own mythology, its own interpretation of events, its own version of truth. This fragmentation is not necessarily destructive. Diversity of thought and perspectives can be healthy for society, but this also means we need to be more conscious than ever about the stories we choose to believe, the narratives we choose to share, the fictions we choose to live by. The same cognitive revolution that allowed our ancestors to cooperate in large groups also equipped them with the tools for large-scale deception and manipulation. The ability to create sheer fiction is inevitable. Also, the ability to spread lies. Throughout history, the stories of us versus them, of chosen people and external enemies, of natural hierarchies and inevitable conflicts have been the primary tools of Diogenes and tyrants. They work because they tap into something fundamental in human psychology. Our need for belonging, our fear of the unknown, our desire for simple explanations in a complex world, we dare not to fully explain. These divisive narratives have been used to justify slavery and genocide, war and oppression, the denial of basic human rights and dignity. They represent the dark side of our storytelling capacity, proof that our greatest strength can also be our greatest weakness. But understanding this pattern gives us power. When we recognize that we are storytelling species, when we understand how narratives shape reality and reality shapes narratives on the other side, we became capable of conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. We can learn to ask the crucial questions. What stories am I telling? What stories am I telling myself? What stories am I being told? Who benefits from these particular narratives? What stories might serve us better? What fictions could create a more just, sustainable, and meaningful world? This is not about being clinical or rejecting all beliefs and commitments. It's about becoming conscious participants in the ongoing human project of collective meaning making. The first stories our ancestors told were not true in any factual sense. They were agreements about how we live together, how to organize society, how to find meaning and purpose in a chaotic and often hostile world. But they were true in a deeper sense. They worked. They enabled unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination. They created the foundations of everything we now call civilization, art and science, law and literature, philosophy and technology. The question for us today is, what stories do we need now? What fictions will serve us in the 21st century? What myths will help us cooperate on a global scale, addressing planetary challenges and creating a future worthy of our highest aspirations? This is the beginning of wisdom, understanding we are the animal that tells stories, and that the stories we tell continue to shape the world we inhabit. The stories that made us human are still making us human. Every day, in every interaction, in every decision we make, we participate in the ongoing creation of shared reality through narratives we embrace, the beliefs we hold, the fictions we agree to live by. The question is not whether we will live by stories. We have no choice in that matter. The question is whether we should choose our stories consciously or allow them to choose us, whether we will be the authors of our own narratives or merely characters in someone else's story, whether we will use our unique human capacity for fiction to create a better world or to justify the world as it is. The first story we must tell ourselves is, the world we inhabit today is not inevitable. It is not natural or necessary or permanent. It is only possible world that could exist. It is a story, collective fiction, a shared agreement about how things should be organized, who should have power, what values guide our decisions, what goals shape our futures. And like all stories, it can be revised, edited, changed. The question that these most fundamental stories is not destroying the fundamental principles of our society. It is to take responsibility for them. It is to recognize that we are not merely consumers of reality, but active co-creators of it. The stories that made us humans are still being written. The cognitive revolution that began 70,000 years ago continues today in every conversation, every decision, every choice we make about what to live and how to live it. The question is, what role will you play in writing these stories? What narratives will you choose to embrace? What fictions will help you to create? Because the future belongs to those who understand the reality is not fixed, the truth is not absolute, that the world is not a given fact, but an ongoing story we tell together. The best stories, the ones that survive and thrive, the ones that make us human, rather than less are those that acknowledge their own nature as stories, well, we still inspiring us to become better than we are right now. This is the paradox we must learn to embrace. We are the species that lives by fiction. We are also the species capable of recognizing fiction for what it is. We need stories to be human, but we also need the wisdom to question those stories, to revise them when they no longer serve us, to choose them consciously rather than inheriting them blindly. The cognitive revolution that made us human 70,000 years ago is not just a historical event, it is an ongoing process. Every day we participate in the creation of sheer realities through the stories we tell, the beliefs we hold, the fictions we agree to live by. The question is not whether these stories are true in some absolute sense, in some absolute scientific factual sense. The question is whether they save us or whether we serve them wisely. Understanding this is the beginning of freedom, not freedom from stories that will be impossible and undesirable for humans, but freedom within stories. The freedom to choose our narratives consciously, to participate actively in their creation, and to take responsibility for their consequences. This is what it means to be human, to live in the space between reality and facts, between truth and story, between what it is and what we choose to make real through our collective imagination and will. We are the animals that told stories. We became the species that shaped the world through power of shared imagination. The question for us is, what world will we imagine into existence?